What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of Stronger TV. I'm Kiefer Lammi, here with Dan Pope, and today we wanted to talk about assessing the hip for the squat specifically. So we have a couple people with us. Hopefully one person's a little stiffer, one person that's a little bit looser, so you can see the difference between those two and how we might treat that athlete differently.
Yeah. All right, so I'm real pumped for this. I think the hip pain, the squat, is something that's really important for people to understand, both coaches and physical therapists, and I hope we can shed some light on this.
Yeah.
First thing I'm going to talk about are what areas need to be mobile when you go into a squat. So you have the world's most mobile squatter here, Nick Giacopello. Am I saying your last name right?
Giacopello.
Yeah. Giacopello, very good. Do you mind just doing a squat facing this way?
Sure.
Yeah, and come forward a little
Take a
bit.
step forward.
The frame. There you go. And pause at the bottom. All right, so from the side, we need to make sure we're having good motion coming from the ankle, some from the knee, as well as the hip. All right, you can stand back up again. Now you can see, Nick's not the most mobile man in the world, right? But if you're watching some of your athletes squatting, you can kind of take a quick glimpse and see where the motion is lacking, right? So go ahead and squat down to the bottom for me. So we're not getting basically below parallel, and this knee is not really traveling at the toe or in front of it, so I would like to first assess ankle mobility. You can also assess the knee mobility, but knee mobility for most people that haven't had, let's say, a surgery is usually pretty good. Moving up the chain, we're looking at the hip and how much it's bending. So are we making contact for the thigh up against the stomach? And we're really not from this position. The last thing that's going to be important is going to be the thoracic spine. So if you're trying to get upright, let's say you caught a snatch, let's go arms overhead, Nick. Good. If we don't move well from here, a lot of times you have to move more from here and here. All right, so go ahead and stand up again. All these pieces have to move well for a good squat. All right. However, if you've broken everything down and we're concerned the hip is a limiting factor, we want to go over how to do that. Anything to add?
Yeah, I just think it's important when you assess, and you kind of went over it, right? A lot of common screens have you go right to doing an overhead squat for an assessment, right? So Nick might do an overhead squat. Go ahead and do one for us. So he's gonna put his arms right up overhead, try to squat the best he can. And he's even maybe a little bit more limited than he was before. And I think we often jump too quickly to saying like, oh, his hips are tight, right? Or his ankles are tight. And so we start mobilizing all that stuff, but we're not taking into account the fact that, his T-spine and his shoulder mobility plays a huge role in whether or not he can do that successfully. Yeah. So I do think it's important when you're doing a screen that you look at the squat type that's specific to what they're trying to do, or you at the very least break it out to see what's going on at each individual part versus just saying, oh, his squat sucks, let's fix hips or let's fix ankles.
Yeah, you got it. It's all that sniper hunter versus like a shotgun hunter, right? Let's say someone just has a left ankle mobility restriction and you look at the overhead squat and it looks like crap and you try to mobilize everything. You might be hurting that athlete, and it's a wild waste of time because really the restriction lies in the ankle. So got to make sure you're assessing everything and not just assuming.
Sure.
Yeah.
All right.
Good. Yeah.
So what do you want to do? You want to hop him on the table?
Well, I want to talk first about performance, right?
Okay.
Because I think this is important, right? So in terms of squat depth, right? In Olympic weightlifting, a lot of times we're trying to squat as deep as we possibly can. So if I'm doing, let's say, a clean, if I don't have to pull the bar quite as high, and I can drop underneath of it and I can get deeper, that's going to help me from a performance perspective, right? So the big thing is not everyone needs to squat as deep as possible, right? It's just going to be very specific to certain situations, Olympic weightlifting being one of those big ones. Make sense? Anything to add with that since that's
nope.
Okay.
No, perfect.
Yeah, you got it. The other thing to think about is that if I am not mobile through my hips specifically, a lot of times the low back will round. Let's go one more squat, Nick, and just kind of try to go as deep as you can. Really, really bury it. So as we go down, you can see at the very bottom, the lower back starts to round. So come on back up again. Let's squat slowly and take a look at the spine. Squat, 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 squat. Right about here it starts to round. Keep on going. And it rounds, 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 rounds. Come back up again, right? So as the lower back starts to round, if I can't extend from my upper back, I'm going to drop a barbell forward, whether that's a clean or a snatch, right? The other thing is now you're loading someone into more lumbar flexion, which may or may not be a bad thing. Obviously, there's going to be flexion in the bottom of a squat, bottom of a deadlift. Some of that is normal. But if I have a ton of lumbar flexion, I'm really loading that up. That may lead to injuries in the future, potentially.
Sure.
What's your thought? Do you allow a lot of lumbar flexion with your athletes?
I think it depends, right? I think if it's, squatting that we're doing in a warm-up, or it's maybe a lighter goblet squat or something, I might give a little bit more freedom for them to play with the motion and work on kind of expanding their mobility in the squat. Mm-hmm. But if it's something that we're really loading up, I'm probably going to pull them back to a point where they can control without a bunch of lumbar motion, and then hopefully trying to build that over time for them.
Okay, very good. Couple thoughts here. So in terms of squat depth, we're looking for the stance that allows us the most mobility. So what we're going to show you is how to assess someone's hip to see how much motion they have in the hip, but also to see if I go wider in my stance or if I toe out more or toe out less, will that afford me more range of motion, right?
Yeah.
And I got to be honest, there's a point where obviously toeing out or going super wide with your stance is maybe not the best from a performance perspective. So you got to keep that in mind. And the other thing you're going to find is some people are just stiff and they need more mobility. But I think this assessment becomes very important because we also have to think about some of the bones within the hip and how they can limit range of motion, and sometimes how that leads to pain. We'll talk about that in a bit.
Sure.
You want to check Nick's hip?
Go for it.
Okay.
Go ahead and lay back.
So this is pretty cool because we already saw Nick squat a little bit, so we already have an idea of how mobile he is. So what we're going to do is assess the hip into pure flexion, and we're going to see if I toe him out further, if I point his leg out, externally rotate it some, or go a little wider, does that change the range of motion? All right? So very tough to see from this angle, I understand. I'll try to come from the side as best I can. But what I'm looking for is, can my thigh come up against my belly here, just like this? And we're missing it, right? We can't quite get there. So the other important thing is that when you assess hip mobility, you want to assess it in the stance the athlete's already taken. So if they squat, let's say this is the normal squat stance for Nick, coming up, can he hit that? No, he can't, all right? The next thing I can try is I can take Nick and I can put him into a little bit of external rotation at the hip and see if he gets a little further, which he does get a little bit extra. And this is one of the reasons why you see people try to toe out more when they're squatting, is it allows them to get more depth, all right? It's also the reason sometimes when people get to the bottom of their squat, they'll toe out, or their knees will pop out wide just because they don't have pure flexion range of motion. They go into a little horizontal abduction, external rotation, all of a sudden they have a little bit more motion, okay? The other piece is that I kind of noted this, but there's three major areas in my head that are going to limit the bottom position of the squat. One are going to be the adductor muscles here. So if I flex my hip and come out wider, especially if I'm a wide stance lifter, the adductors, it's a good chance that they are going to be the limiting factor, all right? The other place is going to be the back side of the hip or the glute muscles, or potentially the capsule as well. So as I come up into this area, the muscles down here can also restrict range of motion. So for a guy like Nick, if I wanted him to be an Olympic weightlifter and he doesn't have the range of motion, those would be the areas I would try to target. Anything to add from there?
Yeah, I was just going to add that I think from a psychological perspective, it's really important to remember like what this athlete's going through as you're assessing them for this, right? Most of the time when you have somebody that's super stiff and you ask them to start going through this assessment and you have them do squatting, like they know they're tight, they know their squat's limited, and they already maybe feel crappy about that, right? So rather than like going through this and finding ways to pick them apart and be like, oh wow, you're really limited here, oh wow, you're really limited here, you're using it as an opportunity to kind of like build rapport and be like, all right, like as I'm looking at your hip mobility here, it seems like you get a little bit restricted here, but look, if we turn you out to a little more externally rotated position, you have some more range. So this might be a strategy that allows you to squat a little bit deeper, and then we can work on these things, and you turn it into a positive for them because you're finding solutions versus saying like, hey, you're bad at this, hey, you're bad at this, squatting's not right for you.
Yeah. Nick, you will never make it to the Olympics.
You may never go to the Olympics,
yeah,
but
you will be an excellent Olympic weightlifter at some point.
Thanks, Dan.
You're welcome, sure.
Cool.
All right. The next thing I want to talk about before we kind of look at some other hips, because we have a couple cool hips here, is I want to talk a little bit about the bony structure of the hips. So I have my friend the pelvis here. So the pelvis is a bowl-shaped bone that sits in your hips, just like this. From your leg, you have your femur that comes up into a ball, and it goes right into your socket. And it's a little tough to see from this angle, but the socket in the hip is actually pretty deep, right? And this is a good thing. It provides a ton of stability. We have to be able to run, jump, change direction, do everything on our feet all day long. So that's actually pretty helpful. The problem is when we get to our end ranges of motion, so if I'm going to the very bottom position of a squat, or if I'm going way back into, let's say, a split, because Dave Tilley works with a ton of these athletes that run into these issues, what ends up happening is you can get some compression of the ball up against the socket, right? And the counter argument to this is that when you bend your hip, when you get to, I think it's like 50 or 55 degrees, you actually start getting some impingement or contact of the ball up against the socket. And as you get to the very end range of motion, I think those forces just increase. So what ends up happening with some athletes is that they can get some painful pinching sensations in the front of their hips if they're doing, let's say, too much squat volume, the program's not right for them, or potentially if they're using the wrong stance, right? Because again, it's tough to see right here and where the socket is oriented, but some people's socket will actually face a little different position. Some people have some torsion or they have some rotation coming from the femur. Some people's sockets will actually point down a little more forward, a little more backwards. And because of that, toe ahead might not be a neutral position for my hip, but it might be a neutral position for May's, right? For me, a neutral position might actually be toed out. So I may walk like a frog, but that's my normal natural position of the hip. That makes sense, guys? The problem becomes, let's say I have a socket that faces outwards, and I'm trying to assess my hip by bringing my leg straight up. I'm going to run out of range of motion quicker because I'm at the end range of my motion by bringing my toe ahead. If I go wider, I may have quite a bit more motion. And that's actually what I have. So I'm kind of an oddball, but I'll show you that hip in a minute. Anything to add to that?
No, I just think this does a good job of highlighting that, more mobility is not always better, right? When you have more mobility, that's more range that you have to be able to control. And particularly for a lot of that crowd, like they're used to just kind of bottoming out into their movements, right? Or just hanging out on their end ranges and stuff without having some sort of understanding of like what it feels like to be strong in those positions or own those positions. Yeah. So oftentimes, like, the people that are stiffer are the people you don't have to worry about getting into like deep positions because they just don't get there, right? But the people that are super mobile are the ones that start getting pinchy hips and stuff like that because they don't have like that sensation of end range. So they don't know when to stay tight or when to stay active.
Yeah, it's funny you say that because a lot of people will think, okay, so if I'm stiff, I'm going to be more likely to get hurt. And maybe because if I don't move well from my hip, maybe my low back rounds a little more stress in my spine, but vice versa, sometimes that stiffness is protective. Right. So if I have a set of muscles that's super stiff, it doesn't really allow me to make bony contact just because my muscles are so stiff that I can't get to that position. So in a lot of ways, being stiff can be helpful, potentially, from an injury prevention standpoint. So that's, again, another reason why it's important to know your athlete and to assess them.
Yeah. Should we take a look at May next?
Yeah, do you want to take over here?
Sure, May, come on over. So we'll do the same thing with May, right? And we'll have her set up in like a comfortable stance. We'll start toes forward. We'll go arms right across. And we'll just have her go through a couple sets of reps of squats. Good, come back up. So a little bit different than Nick's now, right? We've got tons of motion. She can pretty comfortably get all the way to the bottom here. But then when we ask her about squatting, May, how do you feel when you do your squat?
I get a lot of right hip pain.
Okay, so she's saying she gets right hip pain when she gets in the bottom. This is something we already knew about her, right? And so May's background is she's super into yoga. Right? She's always been pretty flexible, trying to do more and more strength training, but every time she gets into a lot of squatting volume, she gets hip irritation, right? Then when you ask her what she's been doing about it, she's probably the person that every time her hip bugs her, she tries to stretch it out more, right? So rather than figuring out a solution for how we can get stronger in those positions or we can maybe modify squatting for, she's basically just picking the scab over and over and over again because she's cranking her hip further and further and further into these end ranges that she's already having trouble in, right? Do you have anything to add for that?
Makes a ton of sense. Yeah. Sometimes the athletes that need mobility the least are the ones that want it the most.
Right.
So it's important to figure that out. Assess people, obviously. So.
Which again is a cool perspective for us to have because as the strength coach or as the therapist, we can talk to this person. We can say, hey, like I want to help you get stronger so that you can do the things you want to do better, right? We're not telling her that yoga is bad. We're not telling her that stretching is bad and stuff. We're educating her on like, all right, look how much motion you already have. Okay, and you're having pain in those motions. Maybe if we try backing off of cranking on your joint in those positions and we work on strengthening around that and we slow things down and you build some awareness of it, then we can make you actually feel a little bit better. So now she's bought into the process because we're helping her do the things that she wants to do more effectively versus taking things away from her or telling her what she's been doing is wrong because that might lose you a client or a patient.
Agree.
You want to take a look at the assessment on the table for her?
Sure, let's do it.
All right.
So again, guys, same exact assessment. You'll notice it's going to be quite a bit different. So one of the things about May is that she also has more ankle dorsiflexion range of motion. So if you compare Nick's squat to May's, ankle dorsiflexion is a little bit better for May. So the other part is that, yeah, she probably has better flexibility in the hip, but also the ankle, so that's going to really allow that rock bottom squat without much trouble at all.
It's going to time.
So what we're going to do is just bring the hip into some flexion here. I'll try to get out of the way so you guys can see, and we'll try to go into what seems like a normal squat stance. Do you squat here-ish? Here? Okay. And we're going to come straight up. What we're looking for is, can the thigh get up against the chest pretty easily? All right, you shouldn't have to put all of your body weight into loading this person's hip to try to get to the end range. You can see it's pretty easy to get to end range. The other thing is that, and I'm just guessing here, but if we go into a little external rotation, a little horizontal abduction, basically toeing out or going wider with their stance, mobility is also pretty good out here. So May is going to be the type of athlete that can squat in a variety of different stances and probably be able to get away with it and look good in multiple different stances.
Yeah.
What happens though is if you get too wide, you start to lose range of motion though. All right, so there's definitely a sweet spot. And some athletes actually are squatting really wide with excessive toe out, and they end up with some problems out here, again, because they're hitting end range, but they're doing it in a little slightly different way than someone who's more toe ahead and doing this, right? That makes sense?
Yeah.
Okay, good stuff.
So then I think when we go into comparison, right, because her right hip was the one that was giving her problems, right? We go through the same assessment, okay, and as we go up, now I'm asking for feedback, right? Like, let me know when you start to feel the same symptoms, okay? So we go up, right about here, right? So she showed that she's got tons of extra motion further than what this is, right? And I can tell him to get here. This is definitely not her end range, but she's already running into issues with some discomfort, right? So we know with foot straight forward, this is probably as deep as we want to go, right? But if we go out to the side a little bit more, let's look at the same thing, right about there.
Yeah.
Still okay?
Yeah.
Good, so we've got more motion, she feels a little bit better, right? So we're having this discussion again, all right, a little bit more toed out, a little bit more externally rotated. We free up a little bit of space for your squatting, right? So this is helping educate us on what might be a comfortable squat stance for her, but then also when it goes to things like doing our single leg training, where she's gonna be in this more neutral or lined up position, right? We can't get her into a deeper hip flexion without giving her a little bit of pain. So it's not just about squatting, it's about how we build the rest of the program around that for her so she can get stronger, right? So split squats, we might not be going in extended range of motion. We might not be doing rear foot elevated split squats. We might give her actually 2 pads so she's going halfway down. So we work to a range that she can control right to here, right? And we can get her legs stronger, we can build some hip strength around it, and then we're supplementing with her squat training in a different stance, and we're trying to build a program around what's comfortable for her body. And then hopefully over time, as we kind of calm down some of her symptoms, maybe we can progress back to things, or maybe it's just an anatomical change for her that we're not gonna change, and we're learning to work around it.
Yeah, you got it. Because I work with a lot of athletes that have some hip pain, and it's kind of chronic in nature. And one of those things that happens is they do this little roller coaster thing. So it's like, okay, I'm really doing well with my training. I get hurt in my hip, and then I go down. And then I feel a little bit better, and I start training again, and it goes back down again. So for those athletes who are trying everything in the under the sun, I guess, in terms of strengthening, modifying their squat stance, modifying the programming, and they're still not making the progress they need to, I think it's probably a good sign to say, hey, maybe let's change that stance potentially permanently, so the lifetime health of my hip improves. I'm not constantly doing this roller coaster ride of better, worse, better, worse, better, worse for the rest of my career. So. And
it's not to say they can't train hard, right? Because she could probably still deadlift in a bunch of different stances pretty comfortably, right? She can do a lot of different things. She might be able to do different squat variations comfortably, but just specific things that she's kind of like jamming a square peg in a round hole and it's not working for her are going to give her issues. So smart programming around that, giving her the confidence that she can still do things, but more importantly, making sure that the program is fitting her goals, which might not actually be to be an Olympic weightlifter. It might just be to get strong enough to do more challenging positions in yoga.
Yeah, right? Olympic yoga competitor.
Cool. So 2 people, totally different ends of the spectrum.
You got it.
With Nick, we might actually be doing a bunch of mobility work, right? We might be limiting his squat in the short term to a box just to build awareness of what his comfortable end range is before he gets to a position where maybe his back's rounding excessively and it gives him some discomfort, right? But we're trying to build on that and also using that box to gauge his progress because maybe we're taking a mat away and we're going lower over time.
Yeah.
Right? And we may, if we did a full assessment, we might break it out and see like, oh, maybe, ankles are more of an issue. Maybe some of these other things are contributing. For May, we're probably slowing things down. We're doing more tempo training, which is something we've talked about a ton, right? We're manipulating other variables like how heavy she's going, how fast she's going, what variations of squatting or what range of motion she's using for those things so that we can make it work for her.
Yeah, a lot of good stuff. Cool. Can I show my hip real quick before we finish up? Anything else you want to add before that?
No, it should be good.
Okay, do you mind if I pop in here real quick, May? It might be hard for you guys to see via the camera. I'll try to go to the side somewhat, but if I try to go completely toe ahead and have my hip pretty much level with my shoulder and go straight up, this is about the max in terms of range of motion that I have. But if I go out wider, I have quite a bit more range. So if I just basically toe out, I get a lot more range. If I toe straight ahead, this is it, right? So it's a pretty big difference. So let me show you what it looks like when I'm squatting. So let's go, feet are gonna be about shoulder width, toes straight ahead. And as I squat, I'm trying to stay as upright as I can. I'm trying to use all my ankle flexibility. When I get to, let's say about here, my low back starts around, and this is what my bottom position looks like. If I keep my heels in place.
Before you even move, keep in mind that like for Dan to do that, Dan actually has a crazy amount of ankle dorsiflexion, right? If you limit that even just a tiny bit to like what might be more commonly what we see for people, right? He's gonna run out of room even faster. Right? Yeah. So he's got a ton of mobility in one place that makes up for the fact that he doesn't have as much somewhere, and it's still not perfect for him.
You got it. And then if I keep my heels in place but spin out my toes, and it's like 30 or 45 degrees, it's quite a bit, and I make sure my knees track out with the toes, so that means I'm externally rotating at the hip, and I go into my squat. It's really easy for me to hit my depth without my back rounding aggressively, right? So what we tend to see with athletes that are like me is that when they go into a squat, when they start to get towards the bottom, they start to spin out with their toes. And people automatically assume, okay, that's an ankle problem, but sometimes it's a hip problem. So again, it comes back to the importance of assessing the hip. Yeah. For myself, I've tried to do a lot of mobility for my hip to see if I can get more range of motion straight ahead. None of that has worked for me over the course of several years. Plus I have a history of kind of flare-ups of hip pain, just like May has. So I've just pretty much chosen to adopt a technique that feels good for me, even though it is pretty toed out, and I run with it, so.
Cool. Cool.
Yeah.
All right, guys, cool. So we've taken a look at a couple different hips. We've talked about how we assess the hip and how your training might vary based on that. We're hoping to do more of these kind of assessment type videos in the future. So if there's something you want to learn more about, make sure you give us a comment or you shoot us a message so we can film it for you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, guys.